On today's episode,
most cancers are simply detected too late. So early detection can increase cancer survival rates very substantially, depending on the cancer type and the data you're looking at, perhaps up to 3 times to 12 times of an increase in survival rates, depending on when cancer is first detected.
welcome to the Active Share podcast that explores less obvious investing insights in a world that's always changing. I'm your host, Hugo Scott-Gall. Today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, global research analysts Tommy Sternberg and Ben Lost, to discuss EditGenetics in the first installment of our Convergence series, which examines 5 growth themes that are shaping the future of investing. This episode will address solving known problems and constraints with existing technology and explore new technology in healthcare, food, and biomaterials. So, Tommy and Ben, welcome. Thanks for being here. And let's get started.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Let's do it.
Right, let's do it. Tommy, your voice is last, so I'm going to pick on you first. In the work that we did around where to find growth, thinking about exactly the shape and profile of growth across a number of industries, you spent quite a lot of time talking about the role of genetics in health and well-being. So could you talk about that and talk about gene therapy? Because I count myself amongst probably the majority who don't really know a lot about gene therapy. What is it? Why is it important? And why is it one of your growth areas?
Yeah, absolutely, Hugo. So when we took a look at the overall healthcare sector and some interesting growth areas for us to be further investigating into where great companies are going to be driving lots of growth. Yeah, absolutely. Genetics and our understanding of it really is driving multiple themes. And the area of gene therapy specifically was a very interesting market for us. Now, for those avid listeners of the Active Share podcast, you may recall that we spoke quite a bit about gene therapies back in a previous episode that we did. Is it science or science fiction? So back then we introduced a number of what I've been referring to as new medicine modalities. So completely novel types of medicines that are making tremendous medical breakthroughs. And we specifically introduced not only gene therapy, but also related modalities of cell therapy and gene editing. So I won't rehash all of those here, but we did want to specifically call out gene therapy on its own, as this market is developing rather quickly. And there have been some significant developments since we had first introduced the topic, both on the medical development front as well as the corporate front in terms of IPOs, M&A, license agreements. So there's a lot of dollars changing hands here, a lot of investment in this area. But maybe I should step back now and just kind of briefly introduce or explain exactly what I mean when I say gene therapy. So a gene therapy approach modifies existing genes or introduces new genes into a patient's body, potentially leading to cures for genetic conditions. So a common gene therapy approach would involve replacing a mutated gene that causes a disease with a corrected version or functional copy of that gene. And just to reemphasize, what's fascinating here is this approach is potentially curative because it addresses the underlying cause of a particular disease that is caused by a specific genetic defect. So you're not just treating the symptoms here. So gene therapies, for instance, are being investigated in genetic disorders such as sickle cell disease, hemophilia, muscular dystrophy, various eye disease, and even congenital deafness. So it's a big opportunity, and we can delve into that a little bit more, Hugo, in terms of the numbers and how we're thinking about it from an investing standpoint as well.
Where do you think then that the growth could kind of really surprise? Because it seems like, we talk about TAMs, total addressable markets, and it seems the addressable markets here could be pretty big given some of the conditions and diseases that you highlighted there. Where could the surprise come? Why can't it come sooner? And what are the things that are in the way?
Yeah, sure. So let's spell out the TAM a little bit, and then we can talk to where perhaps some of the surprises may come from. So in this exercise where we kind of looked across the sector for big and growing markets with big addressable that have big TAMs, as you said, TAM here is potentially as big as $4 trillion, which is almost unheard of. and hard to really wrap your head around that. And how much, can they truly capture? We'll see. But first of all, how do we even arrive at that number? So there are about 40 million people across the US and Europe alone that have a rare genetic disease. And while that patient number alone is not as large as what you would see in other more common diseases such as cancer or cardiovascular disease, but because these rare disease treatments come with very high price points, in some cases well north of $1 million, of course, it's incredibly high, but can actually be justified from a pharmacoeconomic standpoint because of the value that is being brought for these patients due to the severity of this disease, of these various diseases, and what it could mean for their lives. And of course, the ultimate bill that's being paid, even when you sum up this at the moment, is not nearly as large as some of those other disease areas that I mentioned. But when you do the math on that, and let's just say you use a $100,000 price point on 40 million people, that's an incredible addressable market that we got to. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight this. But also, there's a lot of momentum in this area. So there, still only 2 recently approved gene therapies on the market, and this was the same as when we discussed this, over a year ago. But the momentum, continues to skyrocket. At the beginning of the year, there were over 900 ongoing gene therapy trials in the U.S., and so we're, likely to be well north of 1,000 today. And again, thinking of that baseline of just 2 approved therapies out there. Now, you asked about surprises. There are both surprises, both positive and negative. So we need to be mindful of the risks here. And in recent months, there have also been, some high-profile discontinuations of some clinical trials, including, patients dying. So the development path here for gene therapy as a whole is not linear, and that's to be expected. But certainly the promise is there, and there's plenty of investment and momentum behind this opportunity. And then I guess one perhaps less obvious, insight is it's not just the biotech companies themselves that stand to profit from all the development in this area, but, other business models that we like are sort of those partners that work with the drug developers to help them with various services in terms of research, development, and manufacturing. So these are really important enablers of growth in this fast-growing industry. So I think, just we had some surprises that we were kind of starting to uncover this area. For instance, just how expensive and how much, manufacturing space is needed to come up with the raw material, the viral vectors, which is the raw material for these gene therapies. You start to get to pretty high numbers. So that's been one surprise to us that is leading to some investment insights for us as well.
Great, thanks. So I guess one other area we'd like to cover, I'd like to ask you about, is liquid biopsy, which you've said is a growth area. So could you talk about what exactly it is and why you see it as a growth area, and really how much can it grow?
Absolutely. So the area of liquid biopsy is another really burgeoning growth market. There's lots of investment in this area from big companies, small companies, public, private. And just to explain a little bit of what it is, and then we can speak to, with the type of growth opportunity that we're seeing here more broadly. But the value proposition here in terms of the problem that's trying to be solved is readily apparent. So most cancers are simply detected too late. So early detection can increase cancer survival rates very substantially, depending on the cancer type and the data you're looking at, perhaps, up to 3 times to 12 times of an increase in survival rates, depending on when cancer is first detected. However, for an otherwise healthy patient, it's not going to be practical. It's not going to be cost effective or even really justified, medically necessarily to perform a tissue-based biopsy, on various organs if there's no medical reason to do so. But that's why, imaging screening such as mammograms and other procedures like colonoscopies, these have had massive impacts on cancer detections if you go back decades, but there's still so much more that can be done. And that's really the promise of the simple blood-based test that could detect whether you might have an early stage cancer, and the medical as well as societal value of such a test would be enormous. And you know, would understand if there might be a bit of skepticism here, particularly if anyone who's familiar with the Theranos story, if you've read the book Bad Blood, or if you've seen the movie that profiled Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, right? Great promise of kind of curing everything with just a prick of your finger. But there's a reason to be somewhat skeptical of this. But in fact, I think what might surprise many people is we're actually closer than most people think for this to actually become a reality. So just for a little bit of history here. So the first liquid biopsy test was approved in 2016, and it was able to detect a specific type of mutation in a tumor, which is important because not all types of cancers, even if it's in the same organ, are the same. So when a specific type of mutation can be identified, then one type of drug might be more effective in treating that cancer, as many cancer therapies are actually developed to target some of these mutations. So while this type of test was readily available as a tissue-based diagnostic, using a blood-based test has some advantages. For instance, in cases where the tissue is difficult to be biopsied, it's also easier to repeat the test if necessary. So just stepping back, what is the value here then of having this blood-based or liquid biopsy available? Well, there's three primary applications here. The first is therapy selection. So that's the example I just kind of walked through. Another application is recurrence monitoring. So that's actually a pretty big deal. It's way easier to monitor recurrence for existing patients who have maybe already received treatment, to be able to do that with a blood-based test compared to a tissue biopsy. Then you get, more of a real-time, more of a longitudinal view of where the cancer's at and whether it's recurring. And then, of course, the biggest potential application is, of course, early detection or screening, which I mentioned at the outset. So, Hugo, you asked about the growth opportunity. I've kind of walked through, what it means here. So we've sized the liquid biopsy market today at around $600 million. It's certainly south of $1 billion, but the total addressable market we sized at $50 billion. So, and actually since then, we've seen subsequent estimates because there have been some recent activity in the space, valuing it up to $75 billion by 2035. But either way, you're looking at a market that's maybe 1% penetrated, and it's already growing pretty fast. We see sort of the 5-year CAGR around 40% or so. And that's without having tapped into the largest segment, which is that early detection. And, again, early detection going to make up the vast majority of that 75 or 50 billion market opportunity several years down the road. And one final point here is that while we don't have an approved test for early screening, again, very close here. One of the largest companies in the space is expected to have a test available in the market as soon as next year in 2021. So liquid biopsy, a really exciting space, lots of excitement, a lot of action, lots of opportunity.
Great, thanks. Well, that's a very obvious solution to an important problem. So on problems to solve, Ben, I want to bring you in because I guess one of the growth areas you highlighted, and I guess this is a recurring growth area, but the growth in the world's population means that we need to produce more food without increasing costs. So could you talk about why right now that's a particularly interesting growth area, and what are the solutions that you think are making it so attractive?
Yeah, sure, Hugo. I think probably to start off, just a little bit of historical context can kind of give people a window into how we got to where we are today and how that informs the needs of tomorrow. So we still have an increasing population. You see some of the part of the developed world not increasing as much, but you still have strong growth in emerging countries. And so while population growth might not be as strong as it historically has been, it's still present. But even if we were to relax that assumption, there are still very strong growth opportunities. So starting from about the 1800s, we've added about 7 billion people to the planet, 2/3 of which has come since 1950. So this is quite explosive growth relative to the trajectory that we were on. And over that time period, we've actually seen land use for agriculture decrease. The U.S. is down roughly 12 percentage points over the last 50 years. So you look at those two things, you say, well, how do you reconcile this? And you reconcile it by the fact that we've seen on a cumulative basis since the 1950s a 70% increase in farm productivity. That's essentially, if you were to go back to the 1950s, you can draw a 45-degree line, and that's the increase that you would see in yields. And looking back from that, you would see very, very little improvement. So we had this very strong increase that came with some costs that we're learning more about each day. So we added fertilizers, we added a whole series of agricultural chemicals, and then we learned better farming methods, better irrigation, et cetera. But now we're seeing that had some cost, both on the human health side as well as the environmental side. So now we're looking to reformulate and rectify some of those problems, but at the same time, we need to ensure that we're going to have healthy and sustainable food for a global population. And then as we look forward, the incremental growth, given the base effect from a larger population, we're probably going to need to see a 30% increase in farm productivity over the next several decades. So very strong demand for the industry. And so this has kind of created what I'm talking about as a sort of dual mandate. So it's continue to increase productivity, but in a healthier way for the people and the planet. And then running in conjunction with this is the fact that nature isn't standing still. So we've seen bugs, fungi, et cetera, have developed resistances to a lot of these products that have enabled this explosive growth in yield. And so even if we were to put aside these other concerns, we are seeing natural resistance develop, and we're going to need to combat that somehow. And you can look at Roundup or glyphosate as it's known, which is a pretty common example that people see as sort of one area where crops are starting to develop significant resistance to. So this mandate creates a lot of opportunities that we see. And so this is across a $5 trillion global market. I know Tommy talked about $4 trillion. This is a little bit bigger. And so when you look across these opportunities, this is a very prominent theme that we see across the sector. So one area is these biologic alternatives. And this can be either a full-on replacement of chemicals, or it can be a supplement to something that's already in place. And the predominant way that this has manifested itself in the market is through coatings on seeds. And these can do a whole host of things to protecting the crop from insects or disease, requiring less chemicals, or it can do things like enhancing nutrient uptake, which is going to require less need for fertilizers, and that's going to result in better yields and ultimately a healthier planet, because those fertilizers generate a lot of emissions in their production process. So very, very strong growth there. And this is also can be harvested across the animal market, so the protein chain, where we're using a lot of these biologic alternatives along with the combating antibiotic resistance, which is similar to the crop resistance we talked about, but just optimizing the gut health of animals to make the yield conversion from feed to protein optimal. So there's a lot of challenges here. There's a lot of solutions that are coming, but this is still very, very much in the early days.
And again, what are the things that need to be solved? What are the impediments to make us move from early days to some kind of genuine penetration?
Yeah, so there is just the sort of nature of the industry. So we generally have one growing season a year outside of a couple of select markets. And farmers are by nature a conservative group of people. So it takes time to really convince them of new solutions. But we are seeing that come into the market. If you look across the biologic segments of a number of companies, they're reporting growth between 20 and 50%, most of them. So it is happening, but this is coming off of a small base. If you look at certain markets, every acre of some crops does have a biologic product of some sort. But now that we're seeing more of this crop resistance, as well as legislation coming forward, as we learn more about the harmful effects of a number of these chemicals, that's going to really cause an inflection point. And so companies that are well positioned with products in these areas should do quite well. The other thing, and this sort of connects with why these are attractive businesses, is it's not enough to just know that there is a a microbe or the byproduct of the microbe, the enzyme that is useful, but it's very hard to produce consistent, scalable quantities of this. And so that's part of the challenge here is it's not just like fermenting your favorite beer. There's a lot that goes involved with this, as well as making sure that the microbes stay alive to get to where they need to get to, and that they're still in sufficient quantities and they can survive transport and various other environmental impacts. So there's a lot around that continues to need to improve to really be able to produce the quantities of this that we're going to need across the farm complex.
Great. So thinking, related to this demand for more food, can you talk a bit about synthetic protein and how you think the market for protein will change in terms of organic versus synthetic, and again, what are the barriers? What is stopping synthetic protein becoming a much bigger part of that mix?
Yeah, so I think consumer taste does play a role in this, but when we look at the challenges of growing meat, there's a lot of scientific breakthroughs that still have yet to occur there. It's quite tricky to replicate the sort of bone and other structure that we see within an organism and exporting that outside and growing the muscle tissue around it. I think we have a sense of how the muscle component of it works, but it's that other part that seems to be holding us back. And then obviously these are still going to require resources to grow, and figuring out how to properly source that, either if it's from the natural process of a cow out on pasture versus importing that into the lab. There's just a lot of technical challenges to overcome. But one area, and this ties into some of what Tommy was talking about, is biologics as it relates to seeds and this CRISPR technology. I'll spare you what the acronym actually means, because I oftentimes forget it myself. But basically what we're seeing here is the ability to take what we've been doing for generations, which is naturally selecting for the traits that we see as desirable. If you looked back several thousands of years ago, the strawberry that we would see back then, or the stalk of corn we would see back then, would be unrecognizable. This has all been done by generations of us selecting for traits that are optimal for what we're trying to achieve. And so CRISPR is basically a way of just speeding up that process, taking thousands, millions of years and condensing it down into very short periods. So this is another very interesting way of getting about this problem. And in many ways, it's talking more about silencing and the removal of genes from the existing organism rather than inserting new ones in, which is what much of the GMO debate has been about.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to ask both of you the moonshot question. By that, I mean, what are the high impact but currently low probability things that could happen in your respective industries? So, Tommy, you go first. Give me something kind of wacky. Give me something that right now feels unlikely and kind of a bit out there, but just might happen.
Yeah, one area that I'm kind of interested in that's not super close or high on our radar screen, but could perhaps accelerate as a potentially, in terms of the innovation and maybe even investment, from an investment standpoint as well, is longevity and the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, combined with the raw power of genome sequencing. As the cost has come down substantially, the speed has gone up. The advent and the use of CRISPR and other gene editing technologies that Ben mentioned, and applying all these things and other interesting sort of discoveries around certain cells that don't necessarily die as quickly as others, and looking into those to slow down the aging process, I think is a fascinating area of research that we're still in early days, but who knows at some point in the coming years when we may see breakthroughs in that area. So I think that's an interesting area as sort of a moonshot to pay attention to.
Ben, can you match that?
He's not only going to match it, he's going to one up me, I'm sure, just based on the, I throw out a $4 trillion TAM, Ben throws out a $5 trillion TAM. Don't think that didn't go unnoticed.
Yeah. I was waiting for that response. So I think there's 3 moonshots that are sort of worthy of
There you
inclusion.
go, 3 to
See,
Tommy's
it
1.
didn't take long. It didn't take long, just right away. Boom. 3 to 1.
We know your game.
Next time it'll be 9. So the first one I would say is vertical farming. So I think this is going to be a nice sort of buffer or just kind of complement to all of the biologic revolution, use of CRISPR, better seeds, et cetera, that can kind of ensure that we don't have any sort of food shortages. So when you think about vertical farming, what would the advantages be? It'd be controlled environment, be close to the demand centers, and it would allow for continuous production because obviously it's indoors and you don't have to worry about seasons. This is also interesting from a big data, sensors, advanced materials. There's going to be a lot of neat innovations that need to happen there. It's not like it's going to overwhelm traditional agriculture. It's likely going to be limited to certain crops. Mostly it's things like lettuce and similar crops, but that's certainly an area to watch. So you could say, well, why aren't we doing more of it now? Because it costs a lot of money to replicate the sun, which is free when you're outside. So as renewable energy costs come down, those vertical farms become closer and closer to in the money. So I think that's something to watch. And then another piece would just be, we're seeing this across a number of industries, but robotics. And so obviously, as I talked about before, nature plays this game where it's fighting back against the things that we try to do. This will be true on the biologic side as it has been in the synthetic side, but it's going to be quite hard for weeds to evolve a way to get around a metal spear or fork that's walking through the rows and spearing them and taking them out of commission. So you can find some fun videos online about various robots and sort of working through that. And so there's going to need to be a lot of innovation for those camera modules, et cetera, to be able to recognize weeds and other harmful things versus the crop. But that's one way to sort of get us back to organic farming, but without a lot of the cost. And then the third piece I would say is, we talked a lot about microbes and their use on animal and plant, but then their potential on the human side. So thinking about this as bugs as drugs kind of thing, this could be a sort of next frontier in medicine where, we finished the human genome and now we're thinking about the human microbiome, which is essentially all the bacteria that live inside us for mutual benefit, sort of evolving and thinking about human beings as a system. So, we've already seen good evidence of certain microbes and their ability to basically alleviate peanut allergies, but there's a lot of promising data across a whole host of things, including cancer. So I think that's something that's certainly an emerging trend where you're seeing a lot of R&D dollars go into therapies across this area. So there's my 3 moonshots.
Thank you for that. I must admit, when I was growing up, I used to think farmers were farmers. Little did I know they were horizontal farmers. But thank you both very much for sharing just a few of your insights around where to find growth. Really interesting stuff, funky stuff. I think Ben wins on the moonshots. But with that, I'm going to say thank you to you both, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Active Share. To hear additional insights from William Blair Investment Management, visit us at blog.williamblair.com. The Active Share is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and TuneIn. For questions, comments, or topics you'd like to hear discussed, email us at podcastim@williamblair.com.
This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security or to adopt any investment strategy. Investment advice and recommendations can be provided only after careful consideration of investors' objectives, guidelines, and restrictions. The views and opinions expressed are those of the speakers as of the date of this recording, are subject to change without notice as economic and market conditions dictate, and may not reflect the views and opinions of other investment teams within William Blair Investment Management. Factual information has been obtained from sources we believe to be reliable, but its accuracy, completeness, or interpretation cannot be guaranteed. Any discussion of particular topics is not meant to be comprehensive and may be subject to change. This material may include forecasts, estimates, outlooks, projections, and other forward-looking statements. Due to a variety of factors, actual events may differ significantly from those presented. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. Any investment or strategy mentioned herein may not be suitable for every investor. References to specific companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any security. William Blair Investment Management may or may not own any securities of the companies referenced. It should not be assumed that any investment in the companies referenced was or will be profitable.